I never thought a 3-inch piece of wood would become the most important battle of my life until my mother broke her hip in September 2024. My name is Grant Fischer, and what started as a simple home modification to help my disabled mother turned into a war with the Meadowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association in Scottsdale, Arizona, that would expose just how far some people will go to maintain their petty power. My mother, Linda, had lived in her small ranch-style home on Saguaro Lane for 15 years before the accident. She was 73, still sharp as a tack, still made the best peach cobbler in the state, and still called me every Sunday without fail. That Sunday in September, though, the call came from a hospital room instead of her kitchen. She had slipped on a wet tile floor while cleaning, landed wrong, and shattered her left hip. The surgery went well according to the doctors, but the recovery would be long. 6 months minimum before she could walk unassisted again, and even then, she would need a walker or wheelchair for the foreseeable future. I drove down from Flagstaff the day after her surgery, taking a leave from my job as a software developer to help her get settled. My wife Sarah and our 2 kids stayed behind for school, but they understood. Mom needed me, and that was that. When I walked into her hospital room that Tuesday morning, she was sitting up in bed, looking frailer than I had ever seen her, but still managing a smile. "Grant, honey, you did not have to drive all the way down here," she said, reaching for my hand. "Mom, of course I did. We need to figure out how to get you home and make sure you can actually live there." Her smile faded a bit. "I have been thinking about that. Those 3 steps up to the front door are going to be impossible with this hip, and the back door has 2 steps. I do not know how I am going to manage. I had already thought about this on the drive down. We will build you a ramp, a proper wheelchair ramp with handrails." "Problem solved." She squeezed my hand. "What about the HOA? You know how Brenda gets about any changes to the homes." I did know how Brenda Hutchinson got. Brenda was the president of the Meadowbrook Gardens HOA, a position she had held with an iron fist for 7 years. She was 52 years old, had short blonde hair that she kept in a perpetual soccer mom cut, drove a white Lexus SUV with a live laugh love bumper sticker, and treated the HOA covenants like they were the 10 Commandments handed down from God himself. I had dealt with her twice before when visiting Mom, once when Mom's hedge grew 6 inches too tall, and once when Mom put out Halloween decorations 2 days before the approved October 1st start date. Both times had required groveling apologies and immediate compliance. "Let me worry about Brenda," I told Mom. "Your health comes first. We will get the ramp approved." Famous last words. After Mom was discharged on Thursday, I got her settled into her home with a temporary hospital bed in the living room since she could not manage the stairs to her bedroom yet. A home healthcare aide would be coming 3 times a week, but I planned to stay for at least a month to make sure everything was running smoothly. The first order of business was that ramp. Friday morning I measured the front entrance. 3 steps, each 7 inches high, meant I needed a ramp that would rise 21 inches. According to ADA guidelines I looked up online, wheelchair ramps needed a ratio of 1 foot of length for every inch of rise, plus landings. That meant I needed at least a 21-foot ramp, which would extend pretty far into the front yard but was doable. I sketched out a design, priced materials at the local Home Depot, and found a contractor who could start work the following Monday. Then I did what I thought was the responsible thing. I pulled out the Meadowbrook Gardens HOA covenant document, that 40-page monstrosity of rules and regulations that governed everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable height of grass. I found the section on exterior modifications and read through it carefully. Any exterior modification required written approval from the HOA board, submitted at least 30 days in advance with detailed plans and specifications. Failure to obtain approval could result in fines of up to $100 per day until the modification was removed 30 days. Mom could not wait 30 days. She needed that ramp now. But I figured if I explained the medical necessity, submitted proper plans, and asked nicely, surely the board would expedite the approval. These were neighbors, after all. People who had lived near my mother for 15 years. Surely they would have some compassion. I spent Friday afternoon drawing up proper plans for the ramp, including measurements, materials, and even some photos I found online of similar ramps that looked tasteful and unobtrusive. I wrote a cover letter explaining Mom's situation, attached her hospital discharge papers and doctor's orders requiring wheelchair accessibility, and printed everything out in a neat packet. On Saturday morning, I walked 3 houses down to Brenda Hutchinson's immaculate 2-story colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and strategically placed garden gnomes. Brenda answered the door in yoga pants and a tank top, holding a green smoothie. She looked at me with the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes. "Grant Fischer, right? Linda's son?" "Yes, madam. I was hoping to speak with you about an urgent matter regarding my mother's home." Her smile tightened. "If this is about an HOA issue, you need to submit it in writing to the board." I held up the packet. I was hoping you could review it and possibly expedite the approval process given the circumstances." She took the packet, flipped through the first page, and her expression hardened. "A wheelchair ramp? That extends 21 feet into the front yard? My mother just had hip surgery. She is in a wheelchair and cannot access her home without it. I have her medical documentation right there." Brenda flipped through a few more pages, her lips pursed. "The HOA covenant is very clear about exterior modifications. Any structure extending more than 3 feet from the home requires board approval, and we only meet once a month. The next meeting is not until October 15th. That is 3 weeks away. My mother needs this now. She physically cannot enter her home safely. Then perhaps she should consider a temporary living situation until proper approvals can be obtained. The covenant exists to protect all our property values, Grant. If we let one person build whatever they want, where does it end?" I felt heat rising in my chest but forced myself to stay calm. This is not whatever she wants. This is a medical necessity. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities. Brenda's smile disappeared entirely. The ADA applies to public spaces and commercial properties, not private homeowners associations. Nice try, though. I will present your application at the October 15th meeting, and the board will vote on it then. Until that time, no construction may begin." She handed the packet back to me. "Have a nice day." She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds, staring at that door with its cheerful autumn wreath, feeling my blood pressure skyrocket. Then I walked back to Mom's house, got in my car, and drove to the public library. If Brenda Hutchinson thought she could hide behind HOA covenants to deny my disabled mother access to her own home, she had another thing coming. I spent 4 hours at the library researching disability law, HOA regulations, and the intersection of the two. What I found was infuriating and enlightening in equal measure. Brenda was technically correct that the ADA primarily applied to public accommodations and commercial entities. However, the Fair Housing Act, which was a federal law, absolutely applied to homeowners associations. Under the FHA, HOAs were required to grant reasonable accommodations and modifications to people with disabilities. A wheelchair ramp for someone who literally could not access their home without one was about as reasonable as it got. I also discovered that Arizona had its own fair housing laws that mirrored and sometimes exceeded federal protections. And I found case after case of HOAs being sued and losing badly when they denied disability accommodations. One HOA in California had been forced to pay $300,000 in damages and legal fees after denying a wheelchair ramp. Another in Florida had been hit with federal fines, but more importantly, I found the contact information for filing a fair housing complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The process was actually straightforward. You could file online, and HUD was required to investigate complaints within 100 days, though many were resolved much faster. I also found the Arizona Attorney General's Civil Rights Division contact information and learned they handled FHA complaints at the state level too. By the time I left the library, I had a plan. I would give Brenda and the HOA one more chance to do the right thing. If they refused, I would file complaints with both HUD and the State Attorney General's office. And if they still tried to block the ramp or fine my mother, I would build it anyway and let them try to explain to a federal judge why they thought their aesthetic preferences were more important than a disabled woman's ability to enter her own home. On Sunday, I drafted a formal letter to the Meadowbrook Gardens HOA board. I cited the Fair Housing Act, specifically Section 3604(3)(b), which made it unlawful to refuse to make reasonable accommodations in rules, policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person with a disability equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. I cited Arizona Revised Statutes Section 1491.1, the state's fair housing law. I included the same medical documentation and ramp plans, and I gave them a deadline: respond within 72 hours with approval, or I would file federal and state fair housing complaints. I hand-delivered copies to Brenda's house to the HOA's official address, which was a P.O. box that went to a property management company, and sent certified copies via email to every board member whose contact information I could find in the community directory. Then I waited. Monday came and went with no response. The contractor I had lined up called to confirm he could start Tuesday morning if we had the go-ahead. I told him to hold off just one more day. Tuesday afternoon I got a response. Not from Brenda, but from a lawyer named Richard Stone, who identified himself as legal counsel for Meadowbrook Gardens HOA. His letter was 3 pages of legal jargon that boiled down to: the HOA covenant was a binding contract. My mother had agreed to it when she purchased her home. The board had the authority to enforce it, and if I proceeded with construction without approval, the HOA would seek an immediate injunction and pursue maximum fines. The letter did not mention the Fair Housing Act once, not once. It was like my citations of federal and state law had simply been ignored. I called the number on the letterhead. Richard Stone's secretary answered, and after a brief hold, Stone himself picked up. He had a smooth voice, the kind that probably sounded very reassuring to his clients and very condescending to everyone else. Mr. Fischer, I understand you are upset about your mother's situation, but the HOA has rules that must be followed, Mr. Stone. I am not upset. I am confused why you are advising your client to violate federal fair housing law. The Fair Housing Act has exceptions for legitimate HOA regulations, not when those regulations deny reasonable disability accommodations. I have researched this extensively. There are dozens of cases where HOAs have lost exactly this argument. Those cases involve different circumstances. The Meadowbrook Gardens Covenant has specific provisions about front yard structures that exist to maintain property values for all residents. And my mother has a specific medical need that supersedes aesthetic concerns. This is not a garden shed or a basketball hoop. This is access to her home. Stone sighed, that patronizing sigh that lawyers use when they think they are talking to an idiot. Mr. Fischer, my advice to you is to work with the board through the proper channels. Wait for the October meeting. Perhaps the ramp design can be modified to be less intrusive, or perhaps your mother can use the back entrance. The back entrance also has steps. And why should a disabled woman have to go through her back door like a servant while everyone else uses the front door? Do you understand what disability discrimination looks like? I understand what breach of contract looks like. Have a good day, Mr. Fischer. He hung up. I sat there in Mom's kitchen, phone in hand, shaking with anger. Through the window, I could see her struggling to move from her wheelchair to the walker so she could go to the bathroom. The home health aide had left for the day, and these simple transfers that used to take seconds now took minutes and caused visible pain. That was when I stopped playing nice. I opened my laptop and went to the HUD website. The online complaint form was surprisingly simple. Name, address, details of the discrimination, relevant dates, and documentation. I filled it out methodically, attached the medical records, the ramp plans, copies of my letters to the HOA, and the response from their lawyer. In the narrative section, I explained the situation clearly. My disabled mother was being denied the ability to access her home because the HOA prioritized aesthetics over federal disability rights. I hit submit at 6:47 p.m. on Tuesday, October 1st. Then I went to the Arizona Attorney General's website and filed an identical complaint with their Civil Rights Division. Submitted at 7:15 p.m. Wednesday morning, I called the contractor. Start today if you can. I will handle the HOA. Are you sure? If they make you tear it down, you are out the money for materials and labor. They are not going to make me tear it down, trust me. He arrived at 9 a.m. with his crew and materials. By noon, they had the support posts set and were laying the decking. By 3 p.m., the basic ramp structure was complete and they were installing handrails. It was beautiful, honestly, made from composite decking material in a neutral tan color that complemented the house. It had a gentle slope, sturdy rails on both sides, and a small landing at the top. It looked professional and tasteful. It also looked like exactly what it was. A big middle finger to Brenda Hutchinson and her HOA board. Brenda appeared at 4 p.m. as I knew she would. She came marching across the lawn like a general approaching enemy territory, her phone already out and recording video. You were explicitly told not to begin construction without approval, she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. This is a direct violation of the covenant. This is a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act, I replied calmly. I have filed formal complaints with HUD and the Arizona Attorney General's office. Your lawyer can explain to them why you think you are above federal law. Her face went red. You filed what? Fair housing complaints. For disability discrimination, you should receive formal notice within a few days. I would suggest you consult with a lawyer who actually understands civil rights law, because Mr. Stone clearly does not. You cannot just ignore HOA rules because you feel like it. I am not ignoring them. I am exercising my mother's federally protected rights. If you try to fine her, if you try to force removal of this ramp, if you continue to interfere with her disability accommodation, you are going to make those complaints a lot more serious. Right now, you still have a chance to approve this retroactively and make this go away. I would suggest you take that chance. Brenda was practically vibrating with rage. The board will be hearing about this. Legal action will be pursued. You have not heard the end of this. She stormed off, and I went inside to check on Mom. She was sitting in her wheelchair by the window, tears running down her face. Mom, what is wrong? Are you in pain? She shook her head. That ramp is beautiful, Grant. I cannot believe you built that for me. But I am worried about what they will do. The fines, the legal fees. Do not worry about any of that. I promise you. They are not going to do anything once they understand the situation, and if they try, we will fight it and win. The contractor finished up on Thursday morning, and Mom was able to use the ramp for the first time that afternoon. Watching her wheel herself up that gentle slope, open her own front door, and come and go as she pleased without struggling with stairs or needing assistance brought tears to my eyes. This was what disability access was supposed to look like. Simple, dignified, independent. Friday morning I got an envelope in Mom's mailbox from the HOA. It was a formal notice of violation and a fine schedule. $100 per day, starting from the day construction began, until the unauthorized structure was removed. They were billing Mom for $300 already, with amounts increasing daily. I scanned the notice and added it to my complaint file. Then I sent an email to Richard Stone. Mr. Stone, your client has now issued fines for a disability accommodation, which constitutes retaliation under the Fair Housing Act. This significantly strengthens the complaints I filed with HUD and the Arizona AG. I strongly suggest you advise your client to rescind these fines and approve the ramp immediately. The alternative is likely to be a very expensive lesson in federal civil rights law. His response came 2 hours later. Mr. Fischer, you are not a lawyer and should not be giving legal advice. The HOA's position is unchanged. Please remit payment for the fines or further action will be taken. I forwarded the entire email chain to HUD as additional evidence of retaliation. The weekend passed quietly. Mom was getting stronger each day, doing her physical therapy exercises, and the ramp made everything so much easier. Neighbors had started to notice, of course. Some stopped by to ask how Mom was doing and compliment the ramp. Others, the ones who were presumably Team Brenda, would walk by without making eye contact, like the ramp was radioactive. On Monday morning, October 7th, exactly 6 days after I filed the HUD complaint, I got a phone call from a number I did not recognize. I answered cautiously. Is this Grant Fischer? Yes, who is calling? My name is Jennifer Martinez. I am an investigator with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Fair Housing Division. I am calling regarding your complaint against Meadowbrook Gardens Homeowners Association. My heart rate picked up. That was fast. I only filed last Tuesday. Disability accommodation complaints get priority review, especially when there is evidence of immediate harm. I have reviewed your initial complaint and supporting documentation. The case appears straightforward, but I need to conduct interviews with both parties. Are you available to speak with me in detail this afternoon? Absolutely. Whatever you need, I will also be contacting the HOA. In the meantime, I want to be clear. It is illegal for them to retaliate against you or your mother for filing this complaint. If they increase fines, threaten legal action, or take any adverse action, you need to document it and report it to me immediately. They have already started fining my mother $100 per day. There was a pause. When did those fines start? October 2nd, the day after construction began. I have the notice in writing. And when did you file the HUD complaint? The evening of October 1st, before the fines were issued. Okay, that is helpful. Can you send me a copy of that fine notice? I will send it as soon as we hang up. Perfect. I will be in touch soon, Mr. Fischer. And for what it is worth, your documentation is some of the most thorough I have seen from a non-lawyer. You made my job much easier. After hanging up, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Then I emailed Jennifer Martinez the fine notice, the threatening letters from Richard Stone, and every other piece of documentation I had. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Richard Stone, and he sounded significantly less smug. Mr. Fischer, I received a call from HUD this morning. This is an unfortunate misunderstanding that has gotten out of hand. Really? What part is the misunderstanding? The part where you denied my disabled mother a wheelchair ramp, or the part where you fined her for installing one? The board was simply following the covenant procedures. If you had been willing to work with us, I gave you multiple chances to work with me. I cited federal law. I offered to wait 72 hours for approval. You responded with threats and lawyer letters. The board is willing to reconsider the ramp approval. If you withdraw the HUD complaint, we can resolve this amicably. Not a chance. The complaint stays. But the board can still do the right thing and approve the ramp retroactively, rescind the fines, and stop discriminating against disabled residents. Whether they do that or not, the investigation continues. Mr. Fischer, you need to understand that this complaint could have serious consequences for the HOA, including federal fines and sanctions. Maybe that will teach Brenda Hutchinson that HOA rules do not override civil rights laws. Talk to your client, Mr. Stone. Tell them to approve the ramp and drop the fines. Today. I hung up before he could respond. Tuesday morning, October 8th, another envelope arrived from the HOA. I opened it expecting more fines or threats. Instead, I found a letter from the board. Dear Ms. Fischer, upon further review of your situation and consultation with legal counsel, the Meadowbrook Gardens HOA board has determined that your wheelchair ramp constitutes a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. The ramp is hereby retroactively approved as an approved modification. All previously assessed fines are rescinded. We apologize for any inconvenience and wish you well in your recovery. The letter was signed by all 5 board members, including Brenda Hutchinson. I read it twice to make sure I was not hallucinating. 1 week. It had taken 1 week from filing the HUD complaint to complete capitulation. The ramp had gone from absolutely forbidden under any circumstances to retroactively approved, just like that. I called Jennifer Martinez immediately. I just received a letter from the HOA approving the ramp and rescinding all fines. I received a similar letter this morning, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Along with a request to close the investigation as the matter has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. So that is it? We won? That is it. The ramp is approved, the fines are gone, and the HOA has been educated about the Fair Housing Act. I will keep the complaint file open for 90 days to make sure they do not retaliate in other ways, but yes, you won. Congratulations. After hanging up, I went to tell Mom the news. She was in the living room doing leg exercises with her physical therapist, but when I told her the HOA had backed down completely, she actually cried with relief. I was so worried they would take the house or sue me or something, she said. I know you said not to worry, but I could not help it. It is over, Mom. The ramp stays, no fines, nothing. And maybe Brenda learned something about bullying disabled people. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. I thought Brenda would slink away with her tail between her legs, the HOA would leave us alone, and life would return to normal. I should have known better. 2 weeks later, Mom got a notice that her annual HOA assessment was increasing from $800 to $2,000, effective immediately. The letter cited increased legal costs and administration expenses. It was sent to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Gardens, but the timing was not coincidental. This was retaliation, just dressed up as a general increase. I called Jennifer Martinez again. That is absolutely retaliation, she confirmed after I read her the notice. And it is incredibly stupid of them since I explicitly told their lawyer that any retaliatory action would result in serious consequences. Forward me that notice, I am reopening the investigation. This time, Jennifer did not just make phone calls, she showed up in person. I watched from Mom's window as a professional woman in a business suit knocked on Brenda Hutchinson's door on a Tuesday afternoon. The conversation lasted about 30 minutes. When Jennifer left, Brenda's face was pale. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for November 15th, and I made sure to attend. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige building with uncomfortable folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. About 20 homeowners showed up, which was apparently a huge turnout. Brenda sat at a table at the front with the other 4 board members: Tom Winters, Patricia Abbott, Michael Chen, and Susan Rodriguez. They all looked deeply uncomfortable as Brenda called the meeting to order. First order of business, Brenda said, her voice tight, is to address the recent notice regarding HOA assessment increases. After further review and consultation with HUD, the board has determined that the proposed increase was premature. Annual assessments will remain at their current rate of $800. A man in the back raised his hand. Why did we get that notice if it was premature? Brenda's jaw clenched. It was an error in judgment by the board. We apologize for any confusion. I heard it was because you got in trouble with the federal government for messing with Linda Fischer's wheelchair ramp. A woman near the front said. Is that true? The room went silent. Brenda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. The matter regarding Ms. Fischer's disability accommodation has been resolved in accordance with federal law, Brenda said stiffly. The board has been reminded of its obligations under the Fair Housing Act and will be updating our policies to ensure future compliance. So you were discriminating against a disabled woman? Another voice called out. The board made an error in applying the covenants without considering federal fair housing obligations. Tom Winters spoke up, clearly trying to do damage control. We have since corrected that error and received training on disability accommodation requirements. Going forward, any requests for disability accommodations will be handled appropriately and promptly. I raised my hand. Will the board be reimbursing Linda Fischer for the stress and anxiety caused by your initial denial and the retaliatory fine increase? Brenda's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. The fines were rescinded. Ramp was approved. The matter is closed. Actually, Jennifer Martinez's voice came from the back of the room and everyone turned. She had apparently decided to attend the meeting herself. The matter is not quite closed. The board's attempted assessment increase constituted retaliation under the Fair Housing Act. HUD has determined that Meadowbrook Gardens HOA engaged in unlawful housing discrimination. The board has agreed to a consent decree that includes mandatory fair housing training for all board members, policy changes regarding disability accommodations, and a monetary settlement to Ms. Fischer for damages. The details are confidential, but I wanted to assure all residents that the issue has been fully resolved and your HOA will be in compliance with federal law going forward. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Brenda looked like she might throw up. I just sat there, trying not to smile too obviously. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me for standing up to the HOA. Apparently, Brenda's reign of terror had affected more than just my mother. There were stories of fines for minor infractions, threats over trivial violations, and a general atmosphere of fear. My fight had shown people that the HOA was not all-powerful. One elderly man, probably in his 80s, shook my hand with tears in his eyes. My wife had a stroke last year. I was too afraid to ask for a ramp because of Brenda. But now, thanks to what you did, I am going to install one next month. That conversation made the whole fight worth it. The settlement from HUD came through in December. I cannot share the exact amount due to the confidentiality agreement, but it was enough to cover all of Mom's medical expenses not covered by insurance, the cost of the ramp, my lost wages from taking time off work, and then some. More importantly, the consent decree required the HOA to adopt a formal disability accommodation policy that prioritized accessibility over aesthetics and established a fast-track approval process for medical necessity modifications. But the real victory came in January when the HOA held elections for the board. Brenda Hutchinson ran for election as president. She lost in a landslide. In fact, she got only 12 votes out of 143 cast. The new board president was Maria Santos, a nurse who had been appalled by Brenda's treatment of my mother. One of her first acts was to propose amending the covenants to explicitly allow disability accommodations without prior approval, only requiring after-the-fact notification so the HOA could update its records. The amendment passed unanimously. I stayed with Mom through January, making sure she was stable and strong enough to live independently again. The physical therapy had worked wonders. She could walk with a walker for short distances and was becoming proficient with the wheelchair for longer trips. The ramp gave her freedom. She could go out to her garden, visit neighbors, go to the mailbox, all without needing to navigate impossible stairs. On my last day before heading back to Flagstaff, I sat with her on the front porch, looking at that ramp. "You know what the craziest part is?" Mom said. "It is just a ramp. It is just wood and screws and handrails." But it became about so much more. It became about whether rules matter more than people, I said, and whether someone like Brenda Hutchinson gets to decide who deserves dignity and who does not. I am proud of you for fighting. I was scared and I wanted you to just let it go. But you were right. Some things are worth fighting for. You raised me to stand up for what is right, Mom. I was just following your example. She squeezed my hand. That ramp is not just helping me, you know. 3 other families in the neighborhood have installed ramps since ours went up. Brenda would have fought every single one of them, but now they can just install them and file the paperwork. You changed things for a lot of people. That was the part that stuck with me as I drove back to Flagstaff the next morning. The fight had never really been just about one ramp for one disabled woman. It had been about whether homeowners associations could use their power to override basic human rights and dignity. It had been about whether the aesthetics of a neighborhood mattered more than people being able to access their own homes. It had been about standing up to bullies who hide behind rules and regulations to justify cruelty, and we had won. Not just for Mom, but for everyone who would come after her. 6 months later, in July 2025, I got a call from a lawyer in Nevada who had found my story through a fair housing advocacy group. He was representing a family whose HOA was denying a ramp for their son who used a wheelchair. He wanted to know the exact process I had used, what documentation had been most effective, and how quickly HUD had responded. I spent an hour on the phone with him, walking him through every step. 2 weeks after that, he called back to tell me the HOA had approved the ramp within 48 hours of receiving a letter citing my case and threatening a HUD complaint. Then a woman from Oregon reached out through email. Then a man from Texas. Then a couple from Virginia. Word had spread somehow through disability rights circles about the Meadowbrook Gardens case. I was not a lawyer, and I was careful to always recommend people seek legal counsel. But I could share my experience. I could tell people what had worked. I could give them hope that fighting back was possible and worth it. By the time this story ends, in early 2026, I had helped advise 17 different families dealing with similar HOA discrimination. 14 of those cases were resolved in favor of the disabled residents without ever going to court. The other 3 were still pending but looking good. As for Brenda Hutchinson, she sold her house in Meadowbrook Gardens in March 2025 and moved to a golf community in Tucson. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was asked to resign from the HOA board there after only 3 months when she tried to deny a disabled parking space to a resident with MS. Some people never learn. Mom is doing well. She walks with a cane now for short distances, still uses the wheelchair for longer outings, and that ramp is still there, still sturdy, still allowing her to come and go from her home with dignity and independence. She has become something of a local advocate herself, speaking at city council meetings about the importance of accessibility and serving on a county committee that reviews public buildings for ADA compliance. Last month she called me on a Sunday like always, but this time she had news. Grant, you will never believe this. The city is installing wheelchair ramps at all the public parks, and they asked me to consult on the design. That is amazing, Mom. They are calling them Linda ramps. Can you believe that? They are going to have little plaques that say Linda's legacy or something like that. I told them it was your fight, not mine, but they said it was my courage to stay in my home and demand my rights that inspired the initiative. I felt my throat tighten. You deserve that recognition, Mom. You do. We did it together, honey. You and me against Brenda Hutchinson and her ridiculous HOA, and we won. We did, I agreed. We really did. Looking back on the whole experience now, what strikes me most is how unnecessary it all was. If Brenda had just said yes in the first place, if she had shown an ounce of compassion or common sense, none of the drama would have happened. The ramp would have gone up, Mom would have been able to access her home, and life would have continued peacefully. But Brenda chose power over people. She chose rules over compassion. She chose her position and her pride over a disabled woman's basic needs. And in doing so, she taught me one of the most important lessons of my life, that some battles choose you, not the other way around. You can either shrink from them or stand up and fight. I chose to fight, and I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. The 3 inches of wood that made up each of those front steps had been an insurmountable barrier that trapped my mother in her own home. The 21 feet of ramp that replaced them became a symbol of something much bigger. The idea that access is not a privilege, it is a right. That dignity is not negotiable. That federal civil rights laws exist for a reason and they matter. Brenda Hutchinson thought she was protecting property values and maintaining standards. What she was actually doing was discrimination, pure and simple. And when forced to confront that reality by HUD and the threat of federal action, she folded immediately because she knew she was wrong. The lawyer knew it too. That is why they backed down so fast once the complaint was filed. They knew that no court in America would side with an HOA denying a wheelchair ramp to a disabled homeowner. The real question is why they fought it in the first place. Why the first instinct was denial instead of accommodation. Why rules written to prevent tacky lawn ornaments and garish paint colors were applied to a medical necessity. Why the power and authority of the HOA mattered more than doing the obviously right thing. I think about that a lot. About how many HOAs across America are probably doing the same thing right now. How many disabled people are being denied basic accommodations because some petty tyrant on a power trip thinks covenants are more important than civil rights? How many people just give up and move or suffer in silence rather than fight? That is why I share my story with anyone who asks. That is why I walk people through the HUD complaint process and explain their rights under the Fair Housing Act. That is why I spent weeks writing detailed guides about disability accommodation requests and posted them on advocacy websites. Because if my mother had given up, if I had not researched the law and filed those complaints, she would still be trapped in her house, or worse, she would have had to sell and move away from the community she loved. Brenda would have won. The HOA would have continued discriminating. And nothing would have changed, but we did not give up. We fought, we won. And in winning, we made it easier for the next person and the next and the next. That ramp is not just wood and metal. It is proof that standing up to injustice matters. It is proof that one person, armed with knowledge and determination, can take on an institution and win. It is proof that the law, when properly invoked, can protect the vulnerable from the powerful. My mother uses that ramp every single day. Every time she wheels herself up that gentle slope and through her front door, she is exercising the rights and dignity that Brenda Hutchinson tried to deny her. And every time I visit and see her coming and going freely, living independently in the home she has lived in for nearly 2 decades now, I feel that same surge of satisfaction. We did that. We made that happen. Not by asking permission or waiting for approval, but by knowing our rights and refusing to back down. The HOA thought they held all the cards. They had the covenants, the board votes, the lawyer, the threat of fines. What they did not count on was the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and a son who loved his mother enough to go to war over 3 inches of wood and 21 feet of ramp. In the end, federal law trumped HOA rules, as it should every single time. Human rights and dignity will always matter more than property aesthetics and neighborhood conformity. Always, that is the lesson of Linda's ramp. That is the lesson Brenda Hutchinson learned the hard way. And that is the lesson I hope spreads to every HOA in America. Disabled people have rights. Those rights are federally protected, and if you violate them, there will be consequences 1 week. That is all it took from filing the HUD complaint to complete victory. 1 week to go from a denied request and daily fines to full approval and rescinded penalties. 1 week to prove that the system, when you know how to use it, works. I tell people that timeline all the time because it gives them hope. Most people think fighting an HOA means years of litigation and tens of thousands in legal fees. They do not realize that disability discrimination complaints get fast-tracked. They do not realize that HOAs and their lawyers know they will lose these fights, so they fold quickly when faced with federal intervention. They do not realize how powerful a single HUD complaint can be. Now they do, now you do. If you are reading this and you are facing a similar situation, here is what you need to know. You have rights. The Fair Housing Act requires HOAs to grant reasonable accommodations for disabilities. A wheelchair ramp, a disabled parking space, a support animal, whatever you legitimately need to access and enjoy your home, they must accommodate it, unless it causes undue financial burden or fundamentally alters the nature of the housing, which is an incredibly high bar they almost never meet. Document everything. Keep copies of all requests, denials, communications, and medical documentation. Be clear that you are requesting a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act. If they deny it, file a HUD complaint immediately. Do not wait. Do not try to negotiate endlessly. File the complaint and let the federal government do what it does best. Enforce civil rights laws. The HOA will almost certainly back down quickly once HUD gets involved. If they do not, HUD will investigate and make a determination. If HUD finds discrimination, they can impose fines, require policy changes, award damages, and even refer the case for federal prosecution in extreme cases. HOAs do not want any of that, so they cooperate. It works. I have seen it work 17 times now in the cases I have helped with. It will work for you too if you need it. As for me, I am back in Flagstaff with my wife and kids, back at my software development job, back to normal life. But I keep my phone on and my email open for anyone who needs advice or encouragement in their own fight against discriminatory HOAs. I am not a lawyer. I cannot provide legal advice, but I can tell my story. I can share what worked. I can remind people that they are not powerless. And sometimes on Sunday mornings when Mom calls, she will mention seeing someone from the neighborhood out using their own ramp. Someone who would not have had that access if we had not fought our fight first. Those moments make everything worth it. Brenda Hutchinson thought she was enforcing community standards. What she was actually doing was denying a disabled woman her civil rights. She thought the HOA covenant gave her that authority. She was wrong, and when that wrongness was exposed through federal complaint processes, she had no choice but to admit defeat. That is how it should work. That is how it did work. And that is how it will keep working as long as people know their rights and are willing to stand up for them. 3 inches of wood. 21 feet of ramp. 1 week of HUD investigation. Complete victory for disability rights and human dignity. That is the story of how my mother's wheelchair ramp was denied by an overzealous HOA president, and how an ADA complaint, actually a Fair Housing Act complaint, but most people call any disability rights issue an ADA issue, had it approved in under a week. It is a story about standing up to institutional bullying. It is a story about knowing your rights and using them. It is a story about how the legal system, when properly invoked, can protect the vulnerable from petty tyrants. But mostly, it is a story about love. Because at the end of the day, I did not research federal housing law and file government complaints and fight an HOA board, because I am some kind of activist or legal expert. I did it because my mother needed help and I was not going to let anyone, not Brenda Hutchinson, not the HOA board, not their lawyer, tell me that her needs did not matter. She raised me. She supported me. She was there for every milestone and struggle of my life. When she needed me, when she needed someone to fight for her rights and dignity, there was no universe in which I was going to let her down. The ramp was just wood. The fight was about everything that mattered, and we won.